All right, good evening, and welcome to our next installment of the Extending Empathy Project. This evening we have with us Anna George and Eric Wesselmann, who will be talking to you about reducing the moral empathy gap within political conversation. I'm Dr. Nathan Carpenter. I'm with the School of Communication, where I'm the Director of Convergent Media, and I will be monitoring and moderating tonight's talk and providing any technical assistance as necessary. For those of you who are following along on Zoom, we ask that as you have questions or comments that you would like addressed, please put them in the chat and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. For those of you who are following on YouTube this evening, please do provide your comments in the live chat. There is about a 15 to 20 second delay, so we may not get to them in real time, but we will try to respond as quickly as we can. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Scott Jordan.
Thank you, Dr. Carpenter. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the faculty, students, and staff of the Department of Psychology, it's my sincere pleasure to welcome you to the Extending Empathy Project on the road to Tulsa. This project actually started back in 2018 when I invited faculty and graduate students to participate in a project that would help us project a more empathetic voice into our university campus and to the community at large. During that first year, we were able to host 10 colloquia, and then last year we were only able to host 4 due to the pandemic. And then last spring, when I was working on a project with Dr. Carpenter, Dr. Craig, and Dr. Hunt, analyzing Twitter data from HBO's Watchmen series, we recognized that we needed to create some alternative programming for June 20th, 2020 at 7 p.m. Central Time. At that time, Drs. Byron Craig and Steve Racco gave an absolutely amazing talk entitled, "What Should Empathy Be in This Moment of Historical Reckoning? Reconciling Black Trauma, Whiteness, and the Historical Structures of Racism Since 1619. Now, this talk was a smashing success and inspired a conversation that still continues on the School of Communications Facebook page. And immediately following this talk, we knew we had to start a colloquium series, the Extending Empathy Project, on the road to Tulsa. So far, we've had 3 presentations. My presentation focused on asking ourselves whether or not we should begin to assess the quality of our individual empathy by examining the extent to which our lived lives give rise to and sustain more other regarding infrastructures. The second talk was given by Dr. Leandra Paris and provided invaluable insights into effective methods of extending empathy to people experiencing trauma. And our most recent talk was given by Dr. Vanessa Hintz, in which she described aspects of racial identity development and their relationship to empathy and possible ways of working to heal our current cultural divide. Now, recordings of these talks can be found on the YouTube channel at the links provided in the chat. The schedule also contains Zoom and YouTube links for all the upcoming talks. Please feel free to download and share that schedule with all your friends. The series picks up tonight with the 4th of 8 colloquia and ends for the year with a talk given again by Drs. Craig and Racco on Tuesday, June 1st, in commemoration of the Tulsa Massacre of 1921. It is our hope that over the course of this series, we can collectively come to understand an approach to empathy that does not shy away from the hard, important choices we need to make in this country about wealth, inclusion, and opportunity, and their relationship to diversity, inclusion, and justice. We hope you will attend all of our remaining colloquia, join the conversation, spread the word, and help us extend a grounded, resources-informed approach to empathy to a larger and larger audience. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce my dear friend, colleague, and fellow collaborator on this project, Director of the School of Communication, Dr. Stephen Hunt.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jordan, and good evening, everybody. The School of Communication is extremely proud to co-sponsor the Extending Empathy Project with the Department of Psychology, and we look forward to another fascinating talk tonight. I want to thank Dr. Carpenter, who is the school's Director of Convergent Media and all things technologically important. He takes care of and manages and does a great job with that. Also to Dr. Byron Craig, along with Dr. Jordan, we are exploring options to expand this initiative to the universities affiliated with the National American Democracy Project, and we hope to be able to take that to a larger national audience starting next year. We, as always, are thankful to Dean Diane Zosky, who has been a big supporter of this initiative, and also to Dr. Felice Nudelman, who's the Executive Director of the American Democracy Project, who we've been working with to take this national. So with all of that said, it's now my pleasure to turn things over to the amazing, fabulous, and brilliant Dr. Byron Craig, who will introduce the speakers tonight.
Wait, is that me? Yeah. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be a part of this project. So I want to introduce to you the two speakers for this evening. And so first, Anna George is a social data science doctoral student at the University of Oxford. She uses computational approaches to study online political behavior. Her research focuses on the message diffusion of alternative communities, such as hate groups and political extremists. Before joining the doctoral program at Oxford, Anna graduated with distinction from Oxford's master's program in social data science. Anna also holds a master's degree in industrial organizational social psychology from Illinois State University, where she was a Graduate School Merit Fellow and received the Psychology Department's Graduate Student Excellence Award and the department's nomination for the James L. Fisher Outstanding Thesis Competition. Eric D. Wesselmann, PhD, is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Illinois State University. He received his PhD from Purdue University in 2010 with a specialization in social psychology. He is also an ISU alumnus, receiving his BA in 2003 and MA in 2005, both in psychology. His research focuses predominantly on the dynamics of social inclusion and exclusion in daily life, but he's also published theoretical and empirical work relevant to empathy. He is a fellow of Midwestern Psychological Association and the Society for Experimental Social Psychology. He is on the editorial boards for Group Dynamics, Theory, Research, and Practice, the Journal of Social Psychology, and Small Groups Research. So let's welcome them as they give their talk called Reducing the Moral Empathy Gap Within Political Conversations. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you for that warm welcome. Okay, so hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited back to give a presentation on reducing moral empathy gaps within political conversations. Thank you all for putting these talks on empathy together. I was honored to take part in the original ones, and I'm even more excited to be able to join you all again. I'm currently based in Oxford, so it's past midnight here, but it's totally worth staying up to give this presentation and to be with you all today. As you can see, my slides will be in the corner of the screen, and they're a bit smaller than I would have liked, but I thought it was important to have more of a face-to-face conversation, if that can be replicated. So yeah, without further ado, to give a bit more of an outline to what I'll be speaking with you all about, I'm going to be talking about differences in moral preferences and why these differences cause divides. To understand division, Eric and I will be talking about some biases that humans have, and then I will speak a bit on how political divisions become stronger due to moral values and introduce the idea of moral empathy gaps. And to close, I'll talk briefly about some research on potential interventions to close these gaps. So before I start, I do want to center my talk a bit. So there are political stances that can be very harmful, and I'm not asking us to accept those. I recognize that I have the privilege that political beliefs and policies affect my life less on average than they do others. So I'm not asking us to accept hurtful stances, accept hate, and it's definitely okay to cut out harmful and toxic people from our lives, especially if their political beliefs deny you or others basic human rights. What I really want to focus on is divides that are caused between friends and family members who we might otherwise naturally have relationships with, or people that are in our social network, but due to moral empathy gaps or the inability to understand why someone may hold certain views, we can't forge those relationships. So before I start focusing on moral values, I want to start by summarizing the way it is understood that humans make quick decisions. When we make quick judgments, we are more likely to make decisions based on initial feelings and then use heuristics and intuitions to rationalize and explain the reason behind our decisions. In other words, we have gut feelings and we seek to confirm these feelings. Back in the 1970s, David Hume theorized the origins of moral preferences, and he thought we moralized our gut reactions. So Hume observed that feelings were used to determine if an action was morally virtuous. And Hume believed the feelings a person felt when observing an action would determine how moral or immoral the observer perceived the action to be. So if the observer had a negative reaction to whatever action they perceived, then that action would be perceived and deemed immoral. And if the observer had a positive reaction, then the action would be deemed moral. And this is the understanding of morality that Dr. Jonathan Haidt, who developed moral foundations theory that I'm about to introduce, this is the understanding he took when he started studying moral values. And one thing that Dr. Haidt discovered was that we use our gut reactions to guide our decisions based on the moral values that we hold. So he went on to research 6 moral values that each person holds to a different extent. And before I introduce these moral values, I want us all to think through this questionnaire, which I'll make a bit bigger. So here are some example questions from the Moral Foundations questionnaire. And now before I reveal which moral values correspond to which statements, I want to attempt to make this a bit interactive. So when I read the statement, think about when you are deciding whether something is right or wrong, to what extent are the following considerations relevant to your thinking? So first, whether or not someone suffered emotionally. Whether or not an action caused chaos or disorder. Whether or not someone violated standards of purity and decency. Whether or not some people were treated differently than others. And whether or not action showed love for his or her country. And then these questions correspond to 5 of the moral values, which I'm about to introduce: care, respect for authority, purity, fairness, and in-group loyalty. So to explain what these are a bit more, according to moral foundations theory, each human has intuitions that guide their understanding of what is moral and immoral, and each of these moral values has a virtue and vice associated. So first is the moral domain of care. So those high in this value place empathizing with others and valuing human protection as highly important in determining what is right and wrong, and acting with cruelty is seen as immoral. And next, respect for authority. So to determine what is moral and immoral, those high in this value consider things such as respect for hierarchy and respect for legitimate authority, and they consider wrong to be disobeying or disrespect for authority. Next is purity. So those strong in this value see it as moral to avoid contamination and oppose being degrading. Then fairness involves demanding justice, honesty, and those high in this value are angry and consider it immoral when others are not fair to each other. And the value of in-group loyalty is about being loyal to group affiliations, and it's seen as negative to betray these affiliations. And then lastly, liberty. This value was not on the questionnaire I showed because this moral value was discovered later on in Dr. Hyde's career and is often left out of research on the moral foundations theory. But those high in this value of liberty prioritize the freedom of not being controlled and resent oppression. So not everyone holds each of these moral values equally. Social groups and cultures can influence the way these moral values are viewed and prioritized. And you hearing these values and knowing how you thought about the previous statements on the questionnaire I showed you, you may be able to tell already which moral values you're higher or lower on and what enters your consideration for what is moral and immoral. So what Haidt and his colleagues found is that there's evidence that political groups have differences in which moral values they prefer. So it was originally found that conservatives were high in the first 5 moral domains, while liberals were high in the domains of fairness and equality. But current research distinguishes conservatives from liberals by liberals' preference for fairness and equality, and conservatives' preference for authority and group loyalty and purity. However, there is evidence that political group affiliation precedes the formation of these moral value preferences rather than value preferences determining political affiliation. But according to moral foundations theory, differing views on political issues are said to be morally motivated. So the moral values that a person holds could influence the way they view a controversial political issue. And according to the theory, political issues are said to be polarizing due to the moral underpinnings of these issues. For example, they say that human cloning may be a divisive issue because some find it offensive due to it violating their value of purity because it seems like scientists are playing God. I should say from my own work, along with the work of others, conservatives and liberals can be high in these values that the original theory might not think they could be high in, depending on the issue being discussed. For example, usually conservatives prioritize the value of purity higher in their hierarchy more than liberals. But one research study shows that issues such as destroying part of the earth taps into this purity domain for liberals. All this is to say that when we start mixing morals with politics, then we become susceptible to becoming polarized because it's no longer a difference of opinions, but a difference of what we perceive as moral. And that just leads to our ideas and moral justifications getting reinforced based on the groups we're in, and we get caught in echo chambers. So I think we've all heard this word probably a lot lately, and since I study the internet, I want to focus on research related to echo chambers on social media. So we've probably heard by now that most of the content that Twitter users observe related to politics comes from within their own political parties, which may increase polarization. And this limited exposure could partially be explained by moral sentiment differences. So moral values that are expressed in online messaging can influence the popularity of the message and make it less likely that opposing parties will see each other's online messages. So Twitter messages are more likely to be shared when the message contains matching moral values to the reader, and are less likely to be shared when the reader does not hold the moral value embedded in the post, thus limiting message exposure mainly to in-group members. And you might be thinking, well, if we just redesign social media or Twitter to not allow echo chambers so that people are exposed to opposing viewpoints, then that would solve this problem. But unfortunately, simply exposing people to opposing viewpoints is not enough and has actually been shown to have a backfire effect where people feel more strongly about their original viewpoint. And I'm not sure exactly why this is, but I suspect it has something to do with the biases we have as humans. So confirmation bias, I'll make this a little bigger so everyone can read this really quick. So confirmation bias has been getting a lot of attention lately in the era of misinformation. And this is the bias that explains that we favor information that we already believe, so we don't fact check the information we see, or we have a research bias where we actively seek out information we already believe. And the reason I think this bias may partially explain why mere exposure to opposing viewpoints can't decrease polarization is based on an old research study which found that when you're given information that both confirms your viewpoint but also confirms another viewpoint, you ignore the research on the other viewpoint and just focus on the research on yours, and you might start to collect information to back up why you think the way that you do, and you start to become stronger in your own stance. Other biases that we hold, we even have a memory bias, which allows us to recall memories which confirm our beliefs more often than ones that don't. And then, of course, we have an interpretation bias where we interpret people's actions in a way that confirms our beliefs. There's another famous early social psychology study which shows that people can view the same event. In that case, it was a football game, and each side viewed the game in a biased way that made them believe and see their team as having fouled less than the other team. And now you might be thinking again, well, objective fact checking can solve all of this, and no one can dispute the facts. And I think lately we've learned that that's just not the case, and that we solve these biases that are stronger than facts and lead us to find some people to find alternative facts or just simply ignore the truth. A recent study found that sometimes people know information that they're sharing is incorrect and they share it anyway on social media. And what the study found is that those who shared news that they knew was misleading or incorrect, they shared it anyway because the information captured the emotion of how they felt about the issue. So right now I study misinformation and disinformation in the media, and what low quality news sources try to do is write in divisive ways that trigger certain emotions in us, and they structure their reports in a way to restructure what someone might see as true. So part of my dissertation is trying to understand how hate groups reorient a person's worldview through these low quality news sources and try to make people biasly interpret events in the future that confirm this hate group's ideology. So hopefully in 3 years, I can talk a bit more on this and how this happens. But until then, I'm bringing all of this up as a reminder to be aware of the emotions that articles and news reports are trying to elicit in you and what they're trying to get you to believe or share. And now for a bit, pass it on to my colleague, Eric. He will be speaking a bit more about the human biases that we have.
Thank you, Anna. So I'm a little bit less tech savvy than Anna, so I'm going to go old school and just kind of narrate. What I'd like to do is to sort of take a step back and sort of pull the focus and look at these questions from more of a broader social psychological perspective, which is what I know best. So I just want to kind of start with saying that humans are social animals, right? This statement is so well established in the social sciences that it's often taken for granted. But it's worth reiterating here because it's a key component in understanding how we define who we are not, and how we ultimately think about and interact with others. We forge social connections with others easily. Any bit of perceived similarity can facilitate this bonding process and the creation of a group identity. A classic demonstration is in the research conducted by social psychologists Henri Tajfel and John Turner back in the 1970s and 80s, and focused on what they called the minimal groups paradigm. And the crux of this paradigm involves bringing participants into a lab, people who are strangers to each other, and randomly assigning them to different task groups. Researchers have found that simply assigning people to these random groups and giving them a label in this way can make them begin to form an us identity that leads to positive feelings towards one's fellow members. Now, the phenomena doesn't stop there. There's another side to that coin. In addition to forming in-group favoritism, individuals begin to also form negative evaluations and biases against members randomly assigned to the other group. And this occurs even when participants are told explicitly that they're being grouped randomly. Nothing beside the fates or statistical fortune put them where they're at. And this research, in concert with other work by notable social psychologists such as Gordon Allport, centered on the conclusion that our tendency to love our in-groups leads to the opposite phenomena, outgroup hate. Now, in 1999, social psychologist Marilyn Brewer wrote a paper challenging this assumption that they're inexorably linked. Brewer acknowledged that there are many benefits to in-group love, but after reviewing the literature systematically, she found support for the idea that this transition from in-group love to out-group hate is not a foregone conclusion. Rather, it's more likely to occur under certain circumstances. Unfortunately, many of these circumstances that make it likely are present in real-world intergroup dynamics. Now, I'm not going to discuss all of those factors that Brewer identified for the interest of time, but rather I'll focus on one key factor that I think is most relevant to our topics today, and that's that of perceived moral superiority. So a key way that we form an in-group identity is by distinguishing what makes some people similar to us and what makes others different. And there are various ways to do that, but we tend to do it and focus on ways that are meaningful to our self-concepts, such as determining what our key values are, our moral worldviews are, and then organizing around that. Now, the best way to figure out how you mesh with others in terms of moral values is to have meaningful conversations with everyone you come into contact with and find out what they believe and do you match or not. Now, of course, we meet way too many people in our lifetimes to do that with everyone, let alone find time to do that with the people we meet on a daily basis. As such, we use heuristic categories such as religious or political affiliations to provide some sort of categorical information that might sort of give us a general idea of who's likely to share our values and who's not, and then we then treat them accordingly. When talking about differences in moral values, the in-out group distinctions no longer become just descriptive. Rather, they take on an evaluative dimension. People who disagree with us don't just have different opinions, but rather they have incorrect, immoral opinions. And when these value differences play out in the political domain, in which they determine policies that affect others in our country or the global community, the stakes for debate become much higher. It's no longer just a philosophical debate about hypothetically what is right or wrong, quote unquote. But if I may channel work by my friend and colleague, ISU's own political historian, Andrew Hartman, it becomes a war for the soul of one's country. Thus, it's easy to see how one can quickly develop antipathy towards an outgroup member who has a different value than one's own. Now, it's tempting to assume that this type of heuristic decision-making is more likely to happen in one political group than another, right? You know exactly which one I mean, right? Of course, it's that other group. It's not the one that you're affiliated with. Your group would never use these types of heuristics, would they? Well, for better or for worse, recent data suggests that this heuristic decision-making is not a partisan issue, right? One group does not hold the corner on the market for falling prey to identity heuristics. Back in 2005, for example, ISU psychology professors emeriti, Glenn Reeder and John Pryor, published research asking college students of various political affiliations and viewpoints to evaluate others who either shared or disagreed with their views on hot-button social issues, such as the war in Iraq, abortion, same-sex marriage. And they found that regardless of one's own political views, there was one clear pattern. We believe people who agree with us are more intelligent, moral, and pro-socially motivated. Those who disagree with us, however, we view the opposite, right? More recently, social psychologists Anthony Washburn and Linda Skitka examined how the sort of heuristics relate to science denial across political groups. All right, so a cursory glance over the last several years suggests that science denial might be most likely among those people who are conservatively oriented, such as when we look at their skepticism of climate science, or even dealing with the different ways of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, things that many of us would consider moral issues. Washburn and Skitka provided participants with data on a variety of these topics, and these were all actual data from published studies. You know, there was no sort of typical social psychology deception going on, all real data. And just like Reeder et al., they found a clear main effect. One group was not more likely to reject science out of hand than the other. Both did it, right? What mattered was how well did the data support or contradict the participants' moral worldviews. So the take home, none of us are immune, no matter how much we wish it otherwise. We prefer data that support our worldviews, and we like those who agree with us. Now, I'll give you a personal example, right, on just how, as much as we'd like to, maybe we're not immune. I know I certainly am not. Last week, I was prepping my part of this talk, and I heard a story on NPR about the recent national polling that assessed the percentage of people who are refusing to take a COVID-19 vaccine. And the majority of those who are refusing are conservatively oriented individuals who still support the previous administration. Now, the NPR story interviewed longtime Republican pollster Frank Luntz, who was running focus groups trying to figure out how best to persuade these individuals to take the vaccine. And halfway through the interview, I had to turn it off because I was just really, really angry. Every reason I heard from the focus group members just made my blood pressure spike, right? And it just didn't make any sense to me. I felt as I was listening like myself and these individuals were from two different planes of reality. Now, after I calmed down a little bit, I realized that I was doing exactly what this previous research that I've been reviewing finds. So after, chiding myself a bit, I started thinking about it more and saying, well, why, rather than working hard to understand these perspectives, why did I choose to disengage, right? I'm sure many of you have had similar experiences. Now, where does that get us, right? Whether we're talking about interpersonal discussions with friends and family who we may disagree with, or as a country when we're trying to figure out policy, right? So let me be clear, just as my colleague Anna said at the beginning, understanding does not mean agreeing or excusing, right? But persuasion and compromise cannot occur without understanding the perspective of those who differ from us, right? To figure out how to have a conversation that's necessary for a democracy. So how exactly do we bridge that gap, right? That's the million-dollar question. And I suspect that my colleague Anna has some ideas about how we might do that.
Yes, now to the main event. So back in week 1, Dr. Jordan introduced the concept of empathy and reasons we may cognitively lack empathy. And I want to extend this a bit more and talk about moral reasons we might not be able to empathize with outgroup members who have different moral beliefs than us. So first off, it's not completely our fault. We're wired to empathize more with in-group members, and it's been shown that we're instinctively more fearful of out-group members and have automatic negative associations in our brains. So the part of our brain that allows for perspective taking is activated when we encounter in-group members, but not when we encounter out-group members. But other areas of our brain allow us to train ourselves to have control over our automatic responses. So the reason I'm talking so much about moral values and biases is because myself and researchers before me believe that understanding the moral motivations that are driving political opinions can promote understanding and empathy. So if we're aware of what restricts our empathy, then maybe we can work on rewiring ourselves to promote empathy. And what this has to do with moral values is just as moral emotions can unite like-minded individuals, it can also divide those with differing preferences. And the moral value differences between political ideologies may be may make it hard for conservatives and liberals to understand each other's political opinions. And this inability to understand differing political opinions due to the moral value differences is termed a moral empathy gap, meaning that when a political party states their opinions based on the moral value that they find most important, the other party disagrees with the political opinions, partially due to the moral value that's being expressed and that not aligning with their prioritized value. For example, climate change has been shown to be written in a way that is more morally appealing to liberals than conservatives. And this could partially explain why conservatives in America resist climate change initiatives. So to address this, some researchers tried to bridge the moral empathy gap by bringing people's perspectives together on environmental issues by manipulating the structure of an argument to incorporate moral language. So in their study, Republicans and Democrats read a paragraph on environmental issues, and before this, Republicans scored lower on caring about environmental issues compared to Democrats. However, when Republicans read the same environmental content, but the paragraph was written in a way that included their underlying moral preferences, they showed no difference compared to Democrats on environmental stances. So I can show you the paragraph that they showed participants. So show your love for your country by joining the fight to protect the purity of America's natural environment. Take pride in the American tradition of performing one's civic duty by taking responsibility for yourself and the land you call home. By taking a tougher stance on protecting the natural environment, you'll be honoring all of creation. Demonstrate your respect by following the examples of your religious and political leaders who defend America's natural environment. Show your patriotism. So that just very clearly hits at what conservatives find to be their moral preferences. And one conclusion I draw from the study is that we can promote understanding of our political viewpoints if we explain to someone the reason we care for certain issues by explaining it to them using the moral values that they resonate with. And it might seem intuitive to try to facilitate understanding and empathy by expressing your viewpoint through the moral values that are important to others. But when we go to persuade others of our stances, we usually do it based on what moral values we prioritize, because that's likely what convinced us to take such a stance. And then lastly, but quickly before questions, another way to effectively communicate with the other side is to find things you have in common with those people you're interacting with. So try to see the individual, not their group status, and also try to perspective take. Perspective taking has been shown to uniquely increase unintentional empathy, and hopefully by understanding the moral values that might resonate with another person, it can help facilitate perspective taking. So thank you all for listening. It's been a pleasure presenting this work to you, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have, or to hear your ideas and strategies for how to induce empathy in political conversations, because I know it's really hard and something I struggle with as well. So happy to hear everything.
All right, and it looks like there are several questions already in the comments section, in the chat section here. And I'll go ahead and read through them, and feel free to respond, Anna and Eric, as you feel here. So the first one comes from Eros, who asks, actually directs this to you, Anna. He says, I may be biased, but my observation suggests that most liberals appear to show empathy towards conservatives. However, the reverse appears to be less common. Is this gap in empathy due to them holding different values?
Yeah, so what this theory would state is that this empathy gap is due to not understanding why someone would prefer a different value than yourself. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not sure if there is research showing that one side empathizes more with the other or not. Yeah, I'm not sure about that one.
And there's a follow-up question that really basically just says, my experiences align with your observations, Dr. D'Souza. So someone's affirming that same type of experience.
Yeah, I think most of us have probably experienced the other party not being able to empathize with us. Like I said, I'm not sure which one happens more on average. I tend to have a similar experience, but I'm also more liberal, so I'm not sure how conservatives would respond to that question. Eric, do you have more to add to it?
So I'm not sure of any direct research either, but just based on my own personal experiences as well as the research that I reviewed, my suspicion is that there's no partisan divide on these biases, right? That I think these sort of just in-group, out-group things, we just sort of do them, and we're also probably motivated, perception, motivated recall would also suggest we would remember the events that show more empathy coming from our own in-groups than the other. So in the absence of direct empirical tests, I would say it's probably just safe to assume that we all do this.
Yeah, it looks like we have a hand up from Amanda DeVore, and I'm going to go ahead and allow you to ask your question.
So I was just wondering if this was potentially related to that like 80-20% in relationships, where one person always thinks they're the one giving the 80% and the other partner is the one giving the 20, but both partners think they're the 80% giver. Could it be related to that at all?
That's a very interesting connection. I hadn't thought of it in that terms, but there probably is this bias where you feel like you're the one trying to empathize and close that divide more than others.
if I may connect and jump off with what Anna's saying, if we can connect the research on egocentric bias, motivated recall, and perhaps a little bit of narrative psychology, right? We're the heroes of our own stories, right? And so we remember things in ways that help us safeguard our self-concepts in that way.
And it looks like Dr. Jordan has a question as well.
Thank you, Anna and Eric, for that fantastic talk. So Tversky and Kahneman is pretty much the status quo in contemporary psychology regarding decision-making. And this idea of heuristic versus rational decision-making makes it sound as if we're somehow sitting there deciding if we're going to rationally or heuristically address this particular issue. Where contemporary neuroscience indicates that we're always floating on unconscious assumption in every domain, in perception and action and cognition. So here's my question. In the Tversky-Kahneman space, it seems like we have this ability to choose which way we're going to respond. And what it does is prioritize rationalism. What it does is it makes it clear that the best way and the right way, in a sense, to solve these issues is through consciously thinking it out. And it leads to the idea then that we can rationally make our way through our differences by dedicating ourselves to everybody accepting the facts. And Anna, you mentioned how precarious this notion is in your talk. Now, my question is, by overvaluing rationalism, in other words, by putting so much emphasis on rationalism and how we believe is the way to solve problems, yet consistently seeing it fail and fail, do we set ourselves up for frustration, despair, and increased in-group, out-group division? In other words, is this sort of implicit notion in our way of talking about empathy that all we got to do is sit and listen to everyone and we're going to solve these issues, think rationally and we'll do it, and pay attention to the same facts and we'll do it? And if that just doesn't seem to work time and time again, and we become, we despair. So I'm wondering, I guess I'm just repeating myself now. I'll shut up, and if you want me to clarify, I will.
Yeah, so what I think I hear you asking is rationalism the way out of this? And the short answer is no. I think it's amazing that every problem, everyone's like, let's just educate everyone and that's how we'll solve this. And it's still not solving it. So I think that's kind of why I preface this at the beginning, that there are these like biases and heuristics, because this literature kind of came in response to the rationalist thought that we're rational humans beings and we think rationally through everything. So this literature was like, nope, we're not rational all the time. These are times we're not. And that's not to say we can't be rational.
Right.
Of course, there's times we do have time to sit down and think through everything. But especially, I hear people say they see this in their children. There's so much stimuli being thrown at us all the time. We need these shortcuts to be able to understand the worlds that we're in. And now we just see like that we're older and can rationalize the times that it gets us into trouble. So I briefly mentioned it, but I think one way forward, and you would know more on this on the cognitive side, is to kind of like retrain like our implicit responses to things. So like kind of what we're doing is we're trying to train ourselves in a way to instead be more empathetic, which might not come naturally. But that is a hard process. Yeah.
Very difficult. Thank you.
Yep.
Is there anyone waiting, Nathan?
There is no one waiting. Take the floor, Dr. Craig.
Well, okay. So here I go. So I like all of this. I guess my only concern is, let me see if I can phrase this correctly. So, I'm thinking about, of course, I'm going to think about race in this, right? I wonder how you would talk about racial difference in these methods that you're talking about, right? With the understanding that, since 1619, for Black folk, it's going to be, a lot of it's going to be based on the way we've been treated, right? So when we think about this notion of empathy, I guess I was kind of struck with this notion of this heroes of our own stories, right? And earlier, one of you mentioned this notion of fairness, justice. And so I said, for me, it's kind of hard to kind of grapple with all of this because, I don't know if we've ever been able to be the heroes of our own stories, right? So I guess what I'm thinking is, what I'd like to hear is just kind of extrapolate a little bit more on with what you're proposing, what you're talking about. How would, thinking about race, maybe, nuance that a little bit more from when we're thinking about race with what you just discussed, what you talked about. Does that make sense, the question I'm asking?
Yeah, I think so. So
Yeah, let me add one more thing, because I think also for us, and this is something that Dr. Rock and I talked about in our talk. We're grappling with this notion of empathy. Is it even possible in this era for empathy to exist on either side, right? Because we're seeing so much racial division. It's kind of hard to expect us to come to the table and show that kind of empathy, right? Or to say, I'm going to listen. Well, I won't go there. I'll let you respond.
yeah, so I think that's a great point. Very prevalent, obviously, to this conversation. And I actually don't know the answer to the question of, is empathy possible on both sides? Like, I think we, as like myself as a white person and other white people, need to be doing more work, and maybe not asking other communities to have to try to empathize with us when we've historically built structures that disadvantage certain people, or we've been complacent in being part of that disadvantage. So I think that the added layer of race, just looking at the moral values that someone else's holds and say, oh, if you just empathize, like this alone is not enough to solve that. And I think there's a lot more discussion and a lot more that needs to be changed before people can get to the place that it's just about moral values. So this is just a piece of what divides people, but I don't think it can solve race divides.
I don't have much. I don't have. And yeah, I think Anna said it perfectly. That there's definitely that's an important direction for us to sort of pull back and think more about in detail. So.
And in the comments, there are a couple of interesting things happening. So one is Dr. D'Souza has a follow-up where he writes, concerning minorities, they tend to understand the perspective of the majority more often than the reverse, possibly because members of the majority do not even see the minority. I don't know if you have a response to that thought on that topic.
Yeah, just that I agree that maybe me as a majority, I don't have to do as much work because the way that society is structured, I don't have to extend my empathy. I actively try to, but I know that I don't have to. So I'm sorry that people have to take on this extra burden that I don't have to. But yeah, great point.
And in the comments, we have a question from Steve Hunt asking, what about choice architecture? Can we nudge people away from motivated reasoning? can we nudge people not to spread information? And he shares a link to a website called protruthpledge.org, which I suppose if you're listening at home, you can go to it again. It's protruthpledge.org, which looks like an attempt or an initiative to do some of that nudging. I don't know if either of you have run across similar projects or read about similar things, but is choice architecture something we should be thinking about?
So I haven't ran across the site, but I don't know if this is related to the site, but there is a recent research study that shows if you nudge people to think about the accuracy of an article, like before they're shown either true or false information, they're more likely to be primed to think about the accuracy of later articles. So recent research has shown that yes, you can nudge people to not spread misinformation, at least experimentally in the lab.
And we have a question from Jillian, who asks, I'm curious about the role of the teacher here. If our role as educators is to encourage critical thought, should we hide our own political beliefs in the classroom so that students feel able to explore or uncover their own ideas? And overall, what's the role of the teacher's political beliefs in the classroom?
I might pass that off to Eric to start with.
There's a lot to unpack there. I mean, I've talked to colleagues who approached it in both ways. The way I personally, and let me first say that I no data to suggest which is better, one way or the other. I mean, I do my best to be as even-handed as possible about most things. I mean, there are, lines that shouldn't be political that have been made political, unfortunately, in certain situations where I'll just be like, no, talking about, hate speech and things like that, draw my line, right? But I feel like we could have an entire session just on this. I see a thumbs up, so I'm going to take that as at least someone says great. So.
All right. And we have another question from Joey, who asks, do you think that the sense of group membership influences biases against outgroup people?
Yes, there's tons of research on this. So kind of part of what Eric said, like even minimal groups, like splitting people into small groups based on nothing makes them biased against the outgroup. So when you split people by groups and then one thinks that they're better than the other based on things, that they become even more biased. So politics, one political side thinks that they're better than the other, for example. So there's literature on political tribes and how you try to protect your in-group and not your out-group. But yeah, there's tons of research showing the in-group, out-group bias.
And Amanda has her hand up. And go ahead, Amanda.
Thanks. Sorry, it's easier for me just to say it than to try to type it all out. So I'm in Dr. Hilgard's research in social psychology course right now as an elective, but still interesting. And in a Nisbet and Wilson article we just read, it talked about I don't know how to say it, Goethals and Reckman 1973 paper about pro-busing versus anti-busing stances and how they were placed with a Confederate armed with opposing views. And both of these groups that were either strongly pro-busing or strongly anti-busing ended up changing their stances and saying that their initial stance was the opposite that matched their current stance, like to start with, even though that clearly wasn't true and they had record of it. Could something like that be applied in this realm where you, I hate to say, like, trick people into changing how they behave toward others, but kind of instill a cognitive dissonance and get them to maybe adjust their perspectives? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think it's possible, but I think anytime an intervention like this is to be employed, it needs to be well thought out, because I could have really good intentions in the way that I do it, but someone else could use it for really bad things. So originally when I heard of this, for example, and when I heard of the backfire effect, so when people are exposed to different political views, they have this backfire and become stronger in theirs. I was like, oh, if we frame it according to their moral values, then they're probably more likely receptive to hearing that political view. And I had this idea like, oh, I'll do it as like a Twitter experiment and have bots like tweet out these tweets of other political views based on moral values. But then I realized, like, if I was going to run this, I would probably run it to be about like mundane political stances that aren't hotly debated and see if people change on those. But if it is shown to work, like someone could take my research and a terrible scenario, use it to influence people for elections, like for their candidate and such. So I opted to not do that research because I don't want people to take my work and use it for mass manipulation or like have another Cambridge Analytica type scandal. So I think the short answer is yes, it could be done, but we should be really cautious in the ways that we employ these type of interventions if we were to go forward with them.
We have a couple of related questions. And one from Joey asks, is there any way to decrease the sense of group membership for goals of peace?
Well, so if I'm understanding that question, when you say reduce the sense of group membership, do you mean of like in-group, out-group? That's the way I'm interpreting that? Perhaps referencing a theory I particularly like called moral expansion theory. It talks about how we sort of develop our moral borders, right? And in that particular theory, they discuss how can you encourage an expansion of what your moral borders to perhaps, you know, what is normally you would consider to be your out group. How do you expand your in-group boundary to include them, right? And so what's some classic social psychological research by Sharif and Sharif would talk about how do we create superordinate goals. So rather than thinking about us versus them, how do we think of we versus whatever that other might be? And that doesn't have to be a group. That could be, as, and I'm going to channel some conversations that I've had with Scott before, you know, how can we change that to be threats such as, you know, world hunger, dismantling systemic bias, right? I mean, that could become the other, right? So how can we get us to start thinking at that level to achieve the types of things you're talking about?
And it looks like Scott has his hand up. Go right ahead.
Please just go ahead and ask the question in the chat. I'll come in later.
All right, there are a couple more in the chat. One of which asks, are democracy and peace temporary and ephemeral, with oppression and war being the rule rather than the exception?
Maybe this is my naive view of human nature, but how I see that humans have evolved and set ourselves apart is our ability to be social animals and cooperate with each other. So I would like to think that trying to cooperate with one another and hopefully obtain peace in the end is the norm. But there are a lot of times when that doesn't seem to be people's goal. But I hope overall that the norm is to try to be democratic and peaceful.
The optimist in me agrees.
And we have another question along the lines of, again, solutions to misinformation and disinformation. Again, coming from Steve Hunt, asking, might it be more productive to just inoculate people against misinformation? And he shares a link to a game online called getbadnews.com. And again, the idea of inoculation really being, can we just, educate people more? Can we give them a vaccine against, misinformation and disinformation campaigns?
I'm going to jump in here briefly, and some of the education or inoculation that you're talking about kind of gets at what I think Anna was talking about earlier about this sort of retraining, right? And ability is important, right? But all the ability in the world doesn't matter if you don't have the motivation, right? So there's two components there. So I think in addition to giving individuals the tools, how do we perhaps, I'm going to kind of pivot back to Joey's question, right? How do we sort of increase our sort of self-schema, if you will, right? So that we are motivated to sort of overcome these sorts of biases. How to do it? I don't know. Well, let's find out. Let's do the research.
Yeah, that's one thing I'm trying to find out. So I think when we ask these things, we're assuming that people want to not spread misinformation, and there are devious actors that want to spread misinformation to meet some kind of goal, whether it is to reshape someone's worldview or because, like what I shared earlier, the misinformation matches the emotion that they feel about the event. So they kind of want to persuade others to feel the same way about that event. I don't think education will solve everything, but I have seen a few different people that have created games like this and it's shown some success. So I guess we'll continue to see what helps fight misinformation.
And a question from Tatiana in the comments asks, in regards to in-group thinking, why do people tend to put people in boxes, which in most cases cause division? This can cause difficulty in trying to understand each other if we feel divided and against each other in whatever the belief may be. I feel like we are conditioned to be against each other, especially with politics, instead of the idea of agreeing to disagree with obvious limitations like hate speech.
Yeah, so I think my understanding is that humans have evolved to stereotype people and make associations with categories because then it's easier to make sense of this really confusing world that doesn't really make sense, or to not have to think as much through things. So kind of going back to rationalization, we don't have the energy and motivation to think through things. So I guess people tend to put people in boxes because we suck and we're not as smart as we think we are. But yeah, I wish we didn't, and hopefully we can work towards not doing that as much.
Yeah, most, at least sort of social cognitive research on understanding intergroup friction, sort of starts at the social categorization level. So some of the researchers I referenced earlier, Tajfel and Turner, for example, talk about this in the context of identity and categorization, and how at the most basic level, these types of categories are just heuristics. They're cognitive energy savers to try to help us make sense of all the information that we're getting in. So that said, they're just tools. And if you've ever seen me use tools like a hammer, you know that I can use them appropriately or I can use them inappropriately, right? And so I think most social psychologists who would take a cognitive approach would talk about it within that context of these are just tools being used in ways that maybe we need to retrain. What I am going to put in, the chat's working, right? Yeah, I'm going to pop in a citation here, a link to the Marilyn Brewer article that I mentioned earlier, which sort of gives a history of intergroup thinking within social psychology, particularly from these theories, and that might help sort of answer some of the questions in more detail. So it's also one of my favorite articles ever. So.
And Dr. Jordan, I think now's a good moment for you to ask your question.
Thank you, Nate. So, or Nathan, excuse me. So I want to ask a question that brings together the idea of what we should say in our classrooms and the idea of Haidt's work on moral foundations and whether or not there has been any cross-cultural research. And the reason I ask is because when we use a rhetorical system, we're all sitting here using the word politics, moral, and we're kind of experiencing them as different phenomena, or I suspect in the different cultures wouldn't experience morality and politics as two different type of phenomena. So the way we've parsed reality with our rhetoric has an influence on how I'm supposed to answer questions about how I'm in my classroom. Where when I'm in my classroom, what I try to do is find ways of talking about these issues that don't engender the concepts of politics and morality. So I'm asking, has Haidt done any moral foundations work cross-culturally? And do we find that this constellation changes as a function of, if there I might say, more individualist cultures devoted to rationalism, hyper-rationalism, I'll say that, in the United States versus more what I would call holistic or holist cultures in the rest of the world?
Yeah, so this work on moral foundations theory started when he was a PhD student in the 90s. And what he did to gather data to try to understand the moral values that people held is he not only looked at this in America with low and middle and upper class, or maybe it was just low and upper class. He also went to Brazil and looked at their low and upper class and saw like which values he found consistent in both cultures. And for the time period, that seemed to be pretty good. I'm not saying that that definitely means that this generalizes to every culture. This has been researched a lot since the 90s, and people have validated it in other cultures, but there is a huge American bias in research. So this data more easily generalizes to Americans. And I think that's why the research on politics is so US centric, is that's where most of the data is generated. So I think there definitely is a limitation of how far this can be generalized, but there is also some data to show, even originally when he first developed the theory, that this isn't just shown in America.
Thanks.
Someone has a question in the box. I'll wait.
Good question. So Amanda's asking if it was to Americans or Americans who are able to attend a university and agree to participate in research. Really good question. So for those who aren't aware, most research in psychology and probably in general, I just mostly know the psychology field, is mostly based on Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic people. Psychology research tends to be on female university students, and that definitely limits the generalizability of a lot of the studies, especially earlier studies. My understanding of Dr. Height's work, and I don't remember it all off the top of my head, is that he found a random sample because he had got some grant and had these connections where he was able to take it out of the normal sample of who he got, but I could be misremembering that. I definitely remember it was Americans and Brazilians, but I don't remember how exactly he recruited participants.
Putting another link in the chat.
So real quick, I guess that concerns me a little bit because, I mean, I think about like Wesselmann's work, who talks about class being performative, right? And this is coming from a cultural studies rhetorical kind of, background. And so, in hearing what you're talking about, this, looking at at these different classes of people, and this kind of comes back to this word of truth. I just wonder how, how dependable that is. I'm not downing the field of psychology or anything in the way you do research or anything like that, because, Dr. Jordan's on this, I got to be careful. Just kidding. But for me, I guess if we think about class as performative, I'm concerned about the, really the usefulness of the answers. Well, maybe I don't mean usefulness, but how dependable maybe are those answers, right? So I'm just thinking about this. Anytime I hear about something being done with looking at using class in that way, it takes me back a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great criticism. So that was done in the 90s, but maybe I shouldn't have still talked about it in a way that made it sound like that gives it a justification. If Dr. Hilgard was still here, we could talk about all the problems with psychology. And I definitely think that there is a lot of measurement issues and recruitment issues. And maybe next time I should start with those or include them in the talk so that there is more of an awareness of the limitations that the research that I come from can speak to.
I'm actually going to raise my hand. I've been thinking about this now through so many of the questions that have been asked, and kind of in my own interests with social media, and especially seeing so many of the strategies and tactics related to misinformation and disinformation. Is there a point to which the means are getting in the way of the ends, right? I think about the moral foundations that if we're understanding that there are certain values that are trying to either be appealed to or to win out in the end, is there a certain point to which we're seeing these means to those values kind of overwhelming those values, or maybe even changing them?
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, and I might not be, you're asking if the moral values stay the same, or like if they're being catered to. Could you maybe rephrase the
Sure.
question? I'm not sure if I'm...
Yeah, let me provide an example maybe. So let's say, again, I see a disinformation campaign online that's really trying to get people to, let's say, believe in, something related to patriotism. But it's making some really kind of crazy appeals that are like inherently unpatriotic. Are those kind of upending the end goal, which is to try to actually, be patriotic?
Yeah, I think it's crazy that you can use these things and convince people that they're going with their moral values when it's against them. So some research, when I've been looking at political extremists, shows that the text of their doctrines has the same moral values that you would assume they would have based on their political affiliation, but they're extremist. And you're like, how did this lead to you becoming an extremist? Or like, how can we be so closely like associated with political extremists? So there's still social situations, and maybe convincing people with arguments of moral values like is one of them that like leads to some really harmful things that completely go against what the moral value is, if I'm understanding you correctly now. So yeah, it's scary that we can be tricked into believing that we're doing morally righteous things, even if it's so blatant to other people that it's against the moral that's being catered to.
Well, and perhaps to jump off that, or I should say to scale back slightly from the extremist example, right? Because people don't just wake up and become radicalized, right? It's a process, right? And bringing it closer to more the majority of our experiences, right? We have, it's not just, we don't focus on one moral foundation, right? We've got several, and we find ourselves in different situations where sometimes these things conflict, or we have to make choices that pit them against each other. Say, hypothetically, two political candidates who we don't agree with perfectly on either, but we have to choose, the phrase, the lesser of the evils. Well, what does that mean, right? And so, we could think of that in the context of moral dissonance, right? We don't weigh all these things similarly. There's some really great work you should look into by Linda Skicka. I mentioned her earlier when I talked about science denial across the political spectrum. And she does work on moral convictions. And she talks about how, this taking the height idea of intuitionist morality and dialing it up to 11, if I may make a reference to Spinal Tap, right? It's like you sort of elevate this particular value to something that's almost untouchable, right? Like no debate is necessary. Some things are just right and just wrong, right? And I think those are the situations when someone elevates something to a conviction, in Skicka's language. That's where you can see people justifying lots of messy things for that quote unquote greater good, whatever they think it might be.
Thank you both for that. Yeah. So it looks like we have no further hands up at the moment. And in the comments, we have several responses just really saying thank you for wonderful talk and providing just such excellent resources and providing us plenty to be thinking about. I think at this point, Dr. Jordan and Dr. Craig, I should turn it back over to you.
Yeah, so I guess that's me if they don't have any more questions. So I just want to announce the next two talks that are coming up. And first of all, thank you to both of you, soon to be Dr. George and Dr. Wesselmann, for a brilliant conversation. Sorry I asked so many questions. I was just really kind of like really into this one. So I mean, I've been into all of them, but this was just really interesting to me. So thank you. So on April the 13th, Tuesday, April the 13th, same time, same bat channel, 7 to 8:30 p.m. We'll have Dr. Dan Lanham from the Department of Psychology here at ISU presenting on exercising empathy, strengthening our ability to empathize effectively. And then following that, we will have our wonderful Dean, Diane Zosky, PhD, at 7:30, from 7 to 8:30 again on April 27th, doing a presentation on outcomes and process, extending empathy with perpetrators of intimate partner violence. So those are the next two coming up, and I'm sure we'll get links for those to you once again. And I don't, Scott, do you have anything else?
Thank you, Dr. Craig. Scott always has something else. No, I just want to extend my thanks to the two of you for giving this talk. And for me, it's always about the conversation that a good talk engenders. And if you give a good talk, people have understood you well enough to ask the kind of questions that have been asked this evening. So thank you much. And Anna, particularly, what's it, 1:30 where you are right now?
Yeah, luckily we caught me before the time zone changed, so it would be 2:30, but you caught me an hour earlier. So
And thank you so much. And one final thought this talk really asks us to ask ourselves, if we're truly interested in creating a more empathetic culture, what does that mean? Does it mean that we should tell people that they should be empathetic because it's the right thing to do? Or do we work to cultivate people wanting to be more empathetic, right? And interestingly enough, this talk tonight reveals some differences in, if we go to their motivations, that's kind of cheating. Another day, another time, I'll argue that's the beast. And I love and I revel in that space. But nonetheless, appreciate you so much for bringing this to our attention. And thanks to everyone for coming.
yeah, thanks for the wonderful discussion, everyone, and the great questions.
Thank you for the opportunity and the food for thought.
And with that, good night, everyone. Thank you for